Rain stitched the morning to the windows of Harbor and Hearth, a little cafe tucked off a cobblestone lane in Savannah. The storm had come in from the river, slow and heavy, turning the air soft and dim, like the world was whispering and didn't want to be overheard. Inside, lamps glowed amber over jars of sugar and cinnamon. Steam rose from cups fogged glass-softened edges. It was a day that made even strangers feel like confidants. He sat by the window, a man in a travel-worn blazer, one hand around a mug that had long since cooled. He'd taken refuge from the rain, and then somehow from his thoughts. The city lay beyond him as a watercolor, live oaks blurred by water, the river a gray ribbon. He was the sort of person who looked as if his mind had a map no one else could see. Neat lines, careful routes, a plan he could fold and tuck into his pocket. Ethan, though no one here knew his name, yet watched the rain as if it were explaining something he had been too proud to ask. The bell over the door trilled. A small shape wrestled with the weight of the storm and won. She slipped inside raincoat bright as a marigold in a field of slate. Water beaded on her eyelashes, her braids clung damply to her cheeks. She stood for a moment, gathering courage the way children do by holding their breath and listening to their own small hearts. She spotted him. She did not know his name, only that he looked steady like a dock post, sunk deep like someone who would not drift if the wind changed. She crossed the tiled floor on careful feet, the rain whispering off her coat as she moved. "Excuse me, sir." Her voice was small and certain, both the kind of voice that makes you set down whatever you are carrying, even if it is just the heavy weight of your day. Ethan turned. Brown eyes met his bright, watchful, and too old for 7. "Yes," he said, gentle, because the moment asked for gentleness. She folded her hands so tight the knuckles went pale. Then, as if she had rehearsed this 1,000 times, and each rehearsal only made it harder, she lifted her chin. "Please marry my mother," she said. "She's all I have left." The cafe stilled. Even the rain seemed to slow its steady tapping, as if the sky were eavesdropping. For a breath, the words didn't live in the air. They lived in Ethan's chest, blooming into a dozen questions in a single ache. He set his mug down. "What's your name?" "Amara," she answered. "Amara Johnson." "Amara," he repeated, careful with the syllables, honoring them. "That's a brave name." She considered this gravely, then nodded as if bravery were a thing you could wear, and had chosen on purpose. "Mama says brave means you do the right thing, even if your knees shake. My knees are shaking." She looked down at them, surprised to find they belonged to her. Ethan smiled, not to make light of it, but to make room for her courage. "Where is your mother?" Amara pointed toward the counter, where a barista hurried between the milk steamer and the pastry case. Beyond, through the swing door, a narrow glimpse of a kitchen, the swoop of a whisk, a figure in a charcoal apron, whose profile was only a sketch. Dark curls, tied back shoulders, set in the posture of someone who carries the world and has learned not to spill. "She's working," Amara said. "She makes lemon bars that taste like sunshine. But she doesn't smile at them anymore." Outside, thunder rolled over the river like a drum played with entired hand. Ethan felt the old tug of a place that knows your name when you've been trying not to remember it. He had come home to Savannah for a project that would turn maps into streets and sketches into skylines. He had not come for this. Yet here it was, small and fierce, asking for the one thing he could not design on a blueprint. "Why me?" he asked softly. Amara searched his face like it was a window with a light behind it. "Because you look like you listen." The truth of it startled him. He glanced again toward the kitchen. The woman Naomi, though he didn't know that yet, moved in a rhythm born from long hours and longer years. Efficiency was its own kind of tenderness, the careful placement of a slice, the wipe of a plate's rim, the habit of making something beautiful for strangers. "She's all I have," Amara whispered, as if confessing a secret to the rain. "My daddy is with God." She said it simply, the way children fold grief into a single sentence and live inside it. Sometimes Mama looks at a picture by the water, and then she gets quiet like the whole world is a library and she forgot how to read. Ethan felt something in him tilt the way a compass needle twitches when a true north is nearby. "And you think I could help?" Amara nodded. "Some people fix houses, Some people fix streets. I think maybe you fix hearts. She frowned, embarrassed by her own hope. Or at least you could try. He could have told her that hearts are not intersections, and grief is not a cracked step you can level with a shim. He could have told her he didn't know her mother, that grown-up lives are tangled and stubborn. But the storm pressed its forehead to the glass, as if to say, begin. What is your mother's name, he asked. Naomi, Amara said, and the name fell between them like a small bell. Behind the counter, Naomi laughed at something the barista said, a quick, bright sound that vanished almost as soon as it arrived, like a bird startled from a branch. Amara heard it too. Her face lifted toward the sound as if it were sunlight. Amara, Ethan said, sometimes grown-ups get scared of trying again. It doesn't mean they don't want to. I know, she replied. That's why I asked you. I'm 7, so I can say the thing people are scared to say. A long breath traveled through Ethan. He felt the math of his life rearranged, not subtracting anything, only making new sums. He slipped a napkin across the table and borrowed a pen from the sugar caddy. Will you do something for me, he asked. Write down your last name and your mom's and where you live. I can't promise what will happen, but I can promise I'll listen. She printed carefully Amara Johnson letters marching like small brave soldiers. She added an address with a hesitant pride only children have about knowing their own street. When she was done, she pushed the napkin toward him and, without being told, wrote one more thing. Please try. Ethan folded the napkin like a vow and tucked it into his wallet. All right, he said. I will. Amara's shoulders softened. She glanced at the window. The rain seemed lighter now, as if the sky had remembered how to breathe. Thank you, she said, and then shyly, if you need to talk to people, there's a place on Mama's phone where people say nice things about her lemon bars. The nice things help on hard days. Ethan followed her gaze to the chalkboard where someone had written, be kind. It's raining somewhere for someone. He thought of voices, how they can hold you up or let you drown. If people have kind words, he said, meeting Amara's eyes, they should share them. It matters. The bell trilled again. Naomi stepped out from the kitchen with a tray of lemon bars, powdered sugar falling like a quiet snow. For a heartbeat, her gaze caught Ethan's. She didn't know him. Not yet. But recognition of a different sort moved in her eyes, a recognition of attention, of someone truly seeing you in a world that is always walking past. Amara squeezed his fingers, once quick and conspiratorial. That's her, she breathed. That's my whole world. Ethan rose without meaning to, as if the room itself had shifted its center of gravity. Outside, the rain eased into a hush. Inside, something uncharted began to draw its first careful line. If you're reading this by a window while the weather presses close, if you've ever believed that a single brave sentence can change the shape of a day, leave a word, a thought, a little light. Stories travel farther on the warmth of your voices. And if you want to see where Amara's plea carries us next, stay with us. There's so much more to hear. The train slid past marsh and river as dawn opened like a pale shell over Savannah. From his seat, Ethan watched the water take the sky into itself, the way this city always had a gifted borrower, turning reflection into identity. Live oaks lifted their dark arms draped in silver green, and the air seemed to hold memory the way moss holds dew. 12 years is not so long for a place like this. It remembers for you, even when you've sworn you won't ask it to. He arrived with a clean itinerary and a careful heart. The folder in his leather satchel held renderings and budgets, phasing schedules, and stakeholder maps, everything you need to make a shore behave. Chicago had taught him to draw strong lines, to stack steel upon certainty, to be humble before a lake that behaves like an ocean. In Savannah, he would orchestrate a gentler task, stitch a working waterfront to a living neighborhood without unraveling either. The city had hired him because he was precise and unafraid of water. They did not know how much of him had been left here, how many unseen pilings still gripped the mud of his youth. The hotel was a brick relic rehabbed into elegance, tall windows, tall ceilings, the faint perfume of lemon polish. He set down his bag and let the quiet find him. 12 years fit into his reflection, older around the eyes, steadier at the mouth. He had made a profession of convincing riverfronts to trust him. He wondered not for the first time what he had ever done to teach himself the same skill. By 9 he was walking. The river walked with him, a broad, patient presence to his left. Tugboats shouldered barges upriver. Their horns spoke in vowels. Tourists made a bright seam along the promenade, but the city beneath them remained the one he knew, brick arched like rib cage over alleyways, iron balconies fretted with lichened storefronts that wore their age the way beloved faces do. He passed the square where he had learned to dance at a summer block party, the church whose steps he had run as a boy, the corner where he had first kissed a girl and felt time stutter astonished. He had not come back for ghosts. He told himself this the way you tell yourself a forecast technically true until the sky decides otherwise. He had come for the work, the portside renewal that was the name etched into every slide he would present. New flood-resilient bulkheads, public greenways, mixed-income housing, above restored brick warehouses, a small boat launch, where kids could lower their first stubborn skiffs into a river that pretends to be still. There was an old cannery with a roof line like a row of broken teeth. The plan would crown it with glass and community classrooms. There were docks to save and docks to let go. Everything had to be strong enough to meet the water while remaining porous enough to let the city breathe. At City Hall, the conference room smelled faintly of paper and ambition. He shook hands with council members and port officials, with a preservationist whose gaze was all velvet and steel, with a fisherman who folded his cap and unfolded it again, as if trying to smooth out the years this project would ask him to fold into change. Ethan listened before he spoke, mapping the currents in the room. He was good at hearing the part of a sentence that stayed unsaid. When he finally opened his folder, the renderings glowed like a promise. Pathways bent to avoid root flare. Floodable lawns bowed to storm surge and then stood back up again. Market stalls faced morning light and could be shuttered against the sudden. He spoke in the language of civility, setbacks, and elevations, community benefits, the arithmetic of cost and value, and then quietly of belonging. If a waterfront is only for photographs, he said it has failed its oldest work. The river must see children's knees again low as shoreline reads. It must hear the evening talk of people who can afford to live nearby. There was pushback, of course. Concern about traffic, about the honest smell of a working port being replaced by the dishonest smell of fig candles. He answered without armor, acknowledging what projects like this have taken from cities just like this, and how they could be asked to give back. He did not pretend that water forgives cheaply. He did not promise that old ways could remain exactly themselves. He promised to treat the past as a stakeholder, not a stumbling block. When the meeting ended, hands were shook again, lighter now. Someone clapped his shoulder and said, "You speak Savannah without making it do your work for you." He smiled and looked down an old habit from a boyhood where praise felt like stepping too near a muddy bank. Admire it, but watch your footing. Outside, the air had deepened from morning milk to late afternoon amber. He crossed to Harbor and Hearth almost by accident, or so he told himself later. It was on his way from City Hall to the site, or near enough that he could claim coincidence. The bell gave its courteous ring when he entered. Coffee, yes, and something sweet to square the edges of the day. He ordered without paying attention to the menu, the body doing what the mind had not agreed to, yet slowing. He found a window table because he always did. He set his notes aside and let his eyes drift to the life beyond the glass. He noticed details the way planners do a cracked paver that might catch a heel, a bench underused because the nearest shade arrived an hour too late. A crosswalk that painted courage onto asphalt yet didn't slow anyone enough. He wanted to fix things without making them new just to prove he could. He wanted to choose to leave some imperfection as evidence of survival. The rain came, a sudden river-breathed weather that turned day into intimacy. He watched it bead and slide, stitch and unspool, and felt the first quiet loosening of a life kept tightly laundered. He knew what the rain could do, here make the city smell like iron and jasmine, like something wild braided to something made. And then the door chimed again. A small storm in a yellow coat, a small courage walking. Ethan did not yet know her name, only that the room altered itself around the space she occupied. He felt the shift the way you feel a tide turn beneath your feet, a change so steady you don't notice the first inch, only the moment you realize you are standing in a different depth. He had not come for the past. He had rehearsed that sentence on the flight on the walk in the conference room. But the past is not always a place behind you. Sometimes it is a person entering a café while rain quiets the city and the river holds its breath. Sometimes it is a small voice preparing a question large enough to reroute a man's maps. Savannah leaned closer to the glass listening. Ethan wrapped his hands around a warm cup he did not remember receiving, and for the first time since he arrived, let the city's memory rise to meet his own. He did not think of Chicago or schedules or the precise slope of a floodable lawn. He thought of a girl he once knew in the shape of a promise he had never managed to unmake. He thought of water, how it finds its way back every time to where it began. The rain had gentled into a steady murmur, the kind that erases clocks and makes a room feel carved out of time. Ethan sat in his corner of the cafe, hands clasped loosely around the mug he had barely touched. Steam no longer rose from it, but he held it anyway, something to anchor him while the city pressed its memories against the glass. Savannah had always been a city of long shadows and longer recollections. Here stories never disappeared. They lingered like perfume on the air, refusing to be washed away by rain or river. And for Ethan, those stories had a face, a voice, a laugh that once stitched his life into something whole. Naomi Johnson. Her name alone was enough to fracture him, to send him back to summers, where the air tasted of salt and magnolia. He saw again the broad porch of her grandmother's house, the railing where they used to sit hip to hip with books in their laps and secrets on their tongues. She loved poetry, he remembered. Words were her talisman against a world that had not been gentle. She'd read them aloud in a voice soft and strong all at once. And sometimes he'd stop listening to the words just to watch the shape of them fall from her lips. They had grown up in two different worlds. He, the son of a contractor who built foundations with square edges and schedules. She, the granddaughter of a nurse who believed that healing was a kind of stubborn faith. But in the twilight spaces of adolescence, those worlds had overlapped. By the lake, by the bleachers on the sidewalks that glowed after summer storms, they had built a geography of their own, mapped not with streets and lots, but with touches and confessions. He remembered the heat of August nights when the cicadas sang loud enough to make silence impossible, when Naomi leaned against him in the bed of his father's truck and whispered her dreams. She wanted to become a nurse like her grandmother, but also a writer. She wanted to prove that beauty could grow even in the thinnest soil. Ethan, caught between football scholarships and architecture magazines, told her he didn't care where life carried him so long as she was in the passenger seat. That was the boy he had been, reckless in hope, convinced that love was enough to stand against any storm. But then one morning she was gone. No explanation, no goodbye. Just an empty space where she had always been, a silence heavier than grief. She hadn't taken her books from the porch, hadn't told a friend or left a note. She had vanished like mist at sunrise, leaving Ethan to stagger through his final year of high school, with a heart he no longer knew how to use. He remembered the shame of unanswered questions. Had he said something wrong? Was there someone else? Did she grow tired of him, of small-town promises, too fragile to last? His friends told him to forget, to move on. But how does one forget the person who shaped your very idea of what it means to be known? The cafe light caught his reflection in the window, and for a heartbeat he saw not the man in a suit with city projects in his satchel, but the boy with calloused hands and a pocket knife who carved their initials into the bark of a willow tree by the lake. He could still feel the scrape of the blade, the tremor of anticipation, the childish certainty that initials joined in bark meant forever. Savannah looked unchanged. The cobbled streets outside still carried rainwater in rivulets, the live oaks still hunched in their slow devotion to gravity, and the river still exhaled its damp breath across the town. But within that sameness was absence. The old record shop was shuttered. The ball field where he and Naomi had stolen kisses was overgrown. He walked its streets and felt her missing presence everywhere, like music remembered only when silence falls. His mind reached back to one night in particular, the night before she disappeared. They had sat on the hood of his car overlooking the lake, the world slick with moonlight. Naomi had been quieter than usual, her eyes shadowed with some unspoken weight. He had tried to coax it from her, but she only smiled faintly, brushed a hand against his cheek and kissed him with a tenderness that felt like a beginning. He had no way of knowing it was an ending. And now, years later, here he was back in the same city that had once cradled their love and then strangled it with silence. The town carried itself as though time were a circle waiting for him to step back into the loop. Yet he was no boy anymore. He was a man who drew lines on maps and convinced cities to trust him, but who had never redrawn the outline Naomi left behind. Ethan's eyes drifted from the window to the little girl in the yellow raincoat still standing near the counter. She was busy inspecting the pastries, humming softly to herself, but her earlier words clung to him. "Please marry my mother. She's all I have left." It was absurd, impossible, and yet the plea had cracked open a door he thought sealed. Naomi had vanished once, but perhaps fate was not done with them. The town might feel unchanged, but it carried the pulse of unfinished stories waiting to be spoken again. The ghosts of memory pressed close, and Ethan realized he was no longer afraid of them. What terrified him was the possibility that Naomi was here in this same city living another life that had no room for him. Or worse, that she had returned still carrying the silence that had once undone them both. He drew a long breath, steadying himself against the storm inside. Savannah was not just a project, not anymore. It was a reckoning, and sooner than he wished he would have to walk into the past and see whether it would break him again or set him free. Rain still combed the windows into soft, glimmering threads when the girl in yellow returned to Ethan's table. She stood there earnest as a vow, the hem of her coat beaded with droplets that fell one by one to the tile and made tiny constellations at her boots. Close like this, she smelled faintly of wet cotton and lemon sugar, the cafe's perfume clinging to her like a blessing she had borrowed. "My mom is lonely," she said, as if reciting a fact from a school book. "She cries over a picture. It's by the water with a big tree that looks like it's trying to touch its reflection." Ethan felt the floor tilt just slightly, the way a dock answers a new wave. A tree stretching for its own image. He knew that tree. He knew the lake whose skin held summer like a secret. He had carved his history into its bark and called it permanence. "What's in the picture?" he asked, though he already knew what answer he feared. "A boy and a girl," Amara said. "They look like they just remembered something important at the same time." She frowned in concentration, searching for the right words. "Mama says it was a good day that turned into a heavier night." A pause long enough for the espresso machine to sigh. Ethan let the sound cover his uneven breath. "And your mother cries when she sees it. Not always, but sometimes her eyes get shiny, and she looks like she's listening to a song nobody else can hear." Amara glanced toward the counter. Naomi's silhouette was a dark stroke in the doorway to the kitchen, the rhythm of her work quiet and exact. "When that happens, I bring her napkins and pretend to spill water so she has a reason to wipe her face." There was no drama in the child's voice, only a small person's frank understanding of how grief behaves in rooms where other people are trying to be happy. Ethan's chest tightened, admiration and sorrow arriving together, uninvited, inseparable. "What do you want me to do, Amara?" he asked. She lifted a shoulder, modest, practical. "Fix it. Fix your mother's sadness." "Yes." Her eyes did not waver. "You look like you know how to fix big things. Big things are just lots of little things that forgot how to belong together." He almost laughed, but the sound would have been the wrong shape for the moment. "Sometimes sadness isn't broken," he said quietly. "Sometimes it's a place people have to walk through." "I know," she replied, "but maybe someone could walk with her, so it doesn't take so long." He looked at her, then really looked, and the uncanny made itself known. There in the soft ring of brown around her pupils, in the way light caught and held as if unwilling to leave, he saw an echo of a gaze he had once learned by heart. Not identical children are never mirrors, but kin the way certain constellations repeat across different skies. Naomi had watched the world like this, alert to wonder tender, toward its bruises, unwilling to look away. "Has your mother told you about the boy in the picture?" he asked. "She says he listened," Amara said simply, "that he could make even quiet places feel like a conversation. She doesn't say his name." The girl folded and unfolded the sleeve of her coat, gathering a new store of courage. "Sometimes I think if I could find him, he could put the picture back where it belongs," inside her smile. Ethan stared down at his hands. They were steady the way years of drafting and problem-solving had trained them to be. But inside that steadiness moved a younger pulse, the one that used to beat faster at the scrape of bark and the hush of water at night. He cleared his throat. "And you chose me because—" "You noticed the rain," she answered, as if that explained everything. "Most people hurry past it. You watched it like it was telling you something." She leaned in conspiratorial, lowering her voice to a whisper that somehow still carried. "Also, your eyes do the soft kind of thinking. Mama likes that kind." He could not help it. The smile she tugged from him was small and unarmored, like a candle that accepts its own light without apology. "Soft thinking can be dangerous," he said. "It lets the past sit down at your table." "Maybe the past needs a chair," Amara said. "If it stands up too long, it gets mean." They were quiet together. Behind them, spoons chimed against china. Outside, the rain had loosened to a silver gauze. Naomi's laugh, the brief, bright kind that seems to apologize for interrupting, drifted from the kitchen door and vanished again. "Does your mother know you're talking to me?" he asked. "Not yet." A swift flash of mischief, then seriousness again. "But she will. I'm not keeping secrets. I'm just starting the beginning." He studied the girl's face, gathering the details memory would later hoard, the brave line of her chin, the way a raindrop still clung to the end of a braid, the precise tilt of her head when listening. If names were not such heavy coins, he would have spent his here. He would have put Naomi on the table between them and watched how it changed the color of the air. Sometimes, he said instead, people leave because the world asks them to carry something too heavy, and they don't know how to tell the ones they love that both hands are already full. Amara nodded so solemn it broke him a little. "That sounds like my mama." He reached for the napkin she had given him earlier, the one with her careful letters and the address that wore its pride openly. He traced the ink with his thumb as if an old road might light up beneath it. "I can't promise results," he said at last, "but I can promise to be gentle." "That's a good promise," Amara replied, as if assessing a contract. Then she straightened small shoulders, finding their square. "If you see the picture, you'll understand. It's at our house in the front room. The frame is gold and a little scratch like treasure from a story." Before he could answer, a voice came warm and clear from the counter. "Amara, sweetheart, fresh napkins, please." Naomi stepped into view, balancing a tray dotted with lemon bars, powdered sugar, falling like surrendered snow. Her eyes swept the room, pausing only lightly on Ethan, not yet with recognition, only with the grace she gave everyone equally the dignity of being seen. Amara's hand brushed Ethan's in a quick squeeze. Gratitude, trust, a transfer of hope so light it should have weighed nothing, and somehow weighed everything. Then she was gone, yellow bright as a small sun crossing the dim to her mother. Ethan watched them together. The familiar, so familiar curve of Naomi's smile as she bent to tuck a stray braid behind her daughter's ear. The practiced tenderness of a woman who had learned to keep sweetness alive under the discipline of long days. The room filled with the fragrance of lemon and sugar and something like courage. He leaned back, breath shallow, the past sitting down at his table, just as he'd warned it might. Outside, the storm had thinned to a hush that made small sounds important, the click of cups on saucers, the bell's modest clearance of the throat, Amara's whisper, Naomi's laugh. Savannah, unchanged and full of absences, waited at the window like a patient witness. And within Ethan, an old vow he thought time had weathered beyond recognition, began stubbornly to take its original shape. The doorway framed her the way memory frames a dream, more true than the waking world and somehow further away. Naomi stepped from the kitchen with a tray balanced on one palm, the other hand steadying a field of lemon bars dusted white. The powder lifted with each breath she took like quiet weather. In the soft cafe light, her skin held the glow of someone who has learned how to keep moving through fatigue. Her hair gathered into a low knot that made a virtue of haste. A hospital badge lay tucked in her apron pocket, the blue edge showing like an unfinished thought. She spoke first to the room, to the barista, to a couple by the window, to Amar with a glance so instinctive it might have been breath. Then her gaze slid unhurried across tables and coats and flowers on small saucers and found him. The moment was not thunder. It was the stillness that follows it, the fraction of time in which you realize the world has already rearranged itself and you are the last to know. Ethan felt the city subtract its ambient sound until there was nothing left but the sound of his own name in the way she looked at him. Naomi did not drop the tray. That would have been easier. She went very still, and in that stillness he saw the years between them, shifts that began at dusk and ended when the morning felt like a pale apology. The weight of a child sleeping on one shoulder, the arithmetic of bills and kindnesses and days you refused to let harden you. Naomi, he said, or maybe he didn't. Perhaps the name said itself. He had not prepared for the fact that her face would remember him before her voice did. The light changed. The rain outside leaned closer to the glass as if to listen. Her lips parted. Something surprise, a caution, crossed her features in a clean, bright flash like a fish turning beneath water. Then the practiced composure of someone who has learned to function while carrying what cannot be put down. Sir, she began on the ordinary slope of hospitality, and the word broke across recognition. Ethan. The tray trembled. Sugar fell like a small snow. He rose without deciding, to palms open as if approaching a startled animal or a prayer. For a heartbeat the room fell away, and they were only two young people on the lakeshore. Again, sleeves damp with night air, the bark's rough grammar beneath their fingers. He saw the girl who read poems into his collarbone. She saw the boy who knew how to listen with his whole posture. 12 years, he said, and the number felt both too large and too precise to fit inside a sentence. She set the tray on the counter, every motion careful. When she straightened, her breath caught the quiet internal kind that nurses learn to hide from patients, so fear takes longer to arrive. The badge in her pocket flashed the hospital's insignia when she moved. He remembered how she had once wanted to heal the world and then had learned how to do it with her hands. Amara was already halfway to her yellow coat gleaming. She looked from mother to man and back again, measuring a happiness she didn't dare to spend too quickly. "Mama," she whispered, tugging at the apron tie. "This is the man who listens to rain." Naomi's hand rested absently on her daughter's crown, a benediction she was too distracted to name. Her eyes did not leave Ethan's. "I thought," she began, then shook her head. "No, I didn't think. I stopped allowing myself to think." She looked past him as if trying to locate the exit in a theater gone dark. "I have to." He took one step closer and stopped, because time gives you rules, and the first is tenderness. "You don't have to do anything," he said. "Not today. Not because I'm here." The rain found a softer register. A teaspoon chimed against porcelain and seemed embarrassed by its own smallness. Naomi's fingers tightened in the apron's cotton. She was thinner than he remembered, stronger than he knew one body could be. The long nights had carved restraint into her, but they had not stolen the radiance that came when she forgot to protect herself. "Ethan," she said again this time, like a compromise between apology and plea. "I can't." The words stalled. She touched her temple as if pain had set a nail there. "Not here, not at work, not," with her eyes flicked to Amara, and love overtook speech. He nodded. The nod meant, "I understand, and I will wait, and I remember everything." She turned to the barista with a voice that recalibrated itself in a single breath. "I'm stepping out for a moment," she said. "Cover the counter." Then to Amara coat. The girl was already wearing it, small, hand-finding Naomi's without looking, because certain paths are always there even when the lights are off. Naomi moved toward the door. As she passed Ethan, the space between them narrowed to a weather all its own. He caught the clean scent of lemon and soap and the ghost of eucalyptus that hospitals leave in their wake. Their sleeves brushed a brief electric recognition, and both of them steadied as if the floor had shifted. On the sidewalk, the rain had dwindled to a silver idea. Naomi stood under the awning, half-sheltered pupils large in the gray. He followed at a respectful distance, because love has learned restraint in him too. She faced him fully then, and the years did what years sometimes do when they see they are no longer needed. They fell aside like old coats. "You're really here," she said, disbelieving the evidence of her own senses. "I'm here," he answered, the truth coming out clean for once. "Work brought me. And the past will keep you," she murmured, not as accusation, but as fact. She looked down, then up, and something unguarded bloomed in her, the way light briefly visits the surface of deep water. "I can't do this today." She winced at the bluntness and amended softer, "I can't do this yet." "I won't make you," he said. Amara peered between them, solemn, absorbing. "Mama," she asked. Naomi crouched to eye level. "Sweetheart, we're going home." She smoothed a braid that had never needed smoothing and kissed a forehead that hadn't asked for it, for the reassurance was for herself as much as for the child. Then she stood, nodded once to Ethan in a gesture that meant, "I see you. I am not denying you. I'm only saving oxygen," and reached for the door as if it were a solution. "Naomi," he said, the name crossing the small distance like a warm hand. She paused. "I'm not 17, he added. "I won't chase you. I'll wait where you can find me." A swallow of rain slid from the awning and burst at their feet like a small, harmless ending. She met his gaze one last time, their history lifted between them like a veil caught on wind, and then she turned. The bell above the door gave its modest note as she led Amara into the soft, humming dim of the cafe, and moments later back out again, through the far exit into a lane that spilled them toward the river. He did not follow. He stood under the awning and let the new shape of the day settle its weight along his shoulders. The river made its patient sounds, the city continued its careful breathing, and inside his chest an old ache straightened into posture. Time had collapsed and then rebuilt itself around a truth some distances cannot be sprinted. They must be walked even when the map is memory and the weather keeps changing its mind. Night came with the softness of a hand over a fevered brow, and still Ethan could not cool. The hotel room, brick-walled, high-ceilinged, held the day's heat in its bones. Somewhere beyond the tall windows, the river worked at its old, unending task, moving the dark from one shore to another, as if redistributing sorrow so no one place had to carry too much. He undressed with the mechanical care of a man disarming himself. Jacket tie, the careful unbuttoning that gave his hands something to do, while his mind refused to be managed. The mirror offered him a face both known and unfamiliar, the boy's lines redrawn in a steadier script, and tonight the untidy margin note of hurt. He ran water until it turned cold and pressed the cloth to the back of his neck, as if a smaller weather could be invented to counter the storm. Anger arrived first, the quick kind that tries to keep you upright by stiffening every joint. "Why did you leave me?" with silence. It was a young man's question, and it burned with a young man's precision. But confusion soon complicated it. "What did I not see? What weight did you carry I mistook for lightness because I wanted it to be so?" Longing threaded through both silver relentless, because memory is impolite, and comes when called by nothing more than the scent of lemon sugar in a warm room. He lay on the bed without turning out the lamp. The ceiling lifted higher in the softened, light old plaster, taking on the topography of someone's forgotten dream. He tried to arrange the day into a ledger, the waterfront meeting the cafe, the child's plea, the moment when Naomi's gaze struck him clean through. But books balanced in columns cannot hold what the heart records in tides. He thought of how she had said "not yet" with an apology tucked into the consonants. He believed her. He had seen the nurse's steadiness in her, the mother's economy, how she spent herself only where it mattered, how every gesture went through triage before it left her hand. She had not fled out of cruelty. She had fled because oxygen is finite. A knot behind his sternum tightened. He remembered the summer she disappeared, the porch light that stayed off the willow, without its counterweight of laughter, the peculiar humiliation of grief that has no witness. He had not been given the dignity of an ending. He had been given a question to carry. He had carried it so far for so long, he had mistaken it for his posture. The city leaned against the glass in small sounds, distant footsteps, a barge's low vowel, the sympathetic creak of old wood that knows people do not sleep on nights like this. He rose and crossed to the window. Savannah was a darker silhouette of the city he had walked that morning, squares breathing trees embroidering the air with thread. You couldn't see until the breeze made a seam of it. Somewhere in that darkness was a gold-scratched frame with two teenagers smiling at the water as if they could persuade it to keep. "Why are you here now?" he asked the pain, his voice surprising him with its calm. Not accusation, inquiry. Why now, Naomi? Why with a child whose eyes no more than 7 years should teach? Why with a laugh that starts and stops like a bird quick to shelter? He pictured her hospital badge tucked like a secret in the apron pocket. Double shifts, the arithmetic of caregiving, sleeplessness worn as if it were a modest jewel. Perhaps the world had asked everything of her, and she, stubborn and beautiful, had given it. Perhaps leaving had been a mercy he had not earned the right to understand at 17. His anger softened, not into forgiveness that would be arrogance to grant what had not been asked, but into room. He could make room. A planner's work is to carve space from grid and need to protect what must remain porous. He could do that, now shield a perimeter inside himself where haste could not enter. He would not chase. He would not let her vanish. The decision found him then settled like weather that had finally chosen a direction. He would uncover the truth without tearing it from her. He would make himself easy to find. He would visit the cafe in daylight and sit by a window where the sun could argue for gentleness. He would walk by the river and learn the tempo of the city again, so that if she needed words, his would keep time with hers. He would talk to Ruby at the counter, to the barista, with the shy competence to the old men who know the day's gossip and the older truth beneath it. He would not enlist the town as accomplice. He would enlist it as witness. He returned to the bed and for the first time all evening turned off the lamp. Darkness did not close around him. It opened. He let the past take the chair he had been saving for it, as the child had suggested. "Sit," he told it. "You do not have to be mean. You only have to be exact." In the dark, he remembered small particularities that pain had blurred, the way Naomi tucked her lip when reading how she kept a sprig of rosemary in a glass on her windowsill, because she liked the way it made the kitchen smell when the wind was indecisive. He recalled the last kiss by the lake, a slow goodnight with no knowledge of its vocation as goodbye. Sleep came in pieces. In one of them, he stood again beneath the willow carving. The blade made a careful sound against the bark, and this time when he looked up, Naomi was there, older, real, holding the lantern. "Not yet," she said again, but there was a different weather in it now. In the dream, he nodded and put the knife away. He woke before dawn to the hush that cities grow when they are about to forgive themselves for yesterday. The room was cool. A small square of slate light lay on the floor, the window's geometry translated into mercy. He dressed in the quiet and tied his shoes the way he had always done before a day that would need him to be both patient and precise. At the door, he paused, palm on the knob, listening to the river's old counsel. Water does not argue with an obstacle. It learns its shape and keeps going. He exhaled, and for the first time since she'd said his name, felt his breath return as his own. He would find the truth not by forcing it to the surface, but by lowering his voice until it rose to meet him. He stepped into the hall. Morning had not yet declared itself, but its intention was everywhere, a thinning of shadow, a kind of agreement in the boards beneath his feet. Somewhere in this waking city, Naomi was tying her hair back, checking a child's backpack, filling the pocket of her apron with pens and mercy. Somewhere a gold-scratched frame waited for daylight. He followed the faint, faithful pull of the river and let the weight of silence become at last something he could carry without breaking. Morning laid a pale hand across Savannah, and the city woke without hurry. Ethan followed a street he knew by instinct more than memory, the soles of his shoes skimming dew-dark bricks where camellias had dropped their pink coins in the night. The air smelled of river and rosemary. Somewhere a wind chime wrote its quiet algebra. Naomi's grandmother's house rose from the corner like a sentence that had learned patience. White-painted Victorian wraparound porch fretwork casting lace onto the boards. Hydrangeas shouldered the steps in bruised blues and late-season green. A bicycle with a wicker basket leaned against the railing as if it had paused to listen and never left. The house had not forgotten him. The porch still knew the measure of a boy's stride. The rail still kept the memory of elbows and twilight confidences. It was a mercy and a warning both. He paused at the gate, hand resting on the cool latch. Through the screen door, he saw a hallway fretted with morning family photographs marching up the staircase, a side table dressed in crocheted doilies, the glint of a gold frame where the entryway caught the light. The ache of recognition moved through him, not sharp but deep like a tide, persuading itself to turn. The door opened before he could knock. Naomi stood there in a pale blue blouse and scrub pants, hair gathered into a low twist that declared both neatness and need. Barefoot on the threshold, she looked smaller than she had in the cafe, as if the house had called her back to a girlhood she could not be sure would welcome her. Behind her, Amara hovered with the bright solemnity of a child who senses the weather of adults. For a moment, none of them spoke. The porch fan ticked over their silence. A dragonfly stitched blue thread through the sun between them. "Good morning," Ethan said, because beginnings must be gentle. Naomi's fingers tightened around the door jamb. "You shouldn't be here," she said, then softened it. "I mean without calling." "I didn't have your number," he answered and tried a smile that did not presume. Only an address written in brave letters. Amara's face brightened with ownership of the fact. Naomi glanced down, and for one fragile second a laugh trembled in her. She contained it. "I have to leave for the hospital in 40 minutes, she said. "It's not a good time." "I'll walk away if you ask me to," Ethan said. "I will not make a scene. But if there's a place in your day for 5 honest minutes," he let the phrase trail, "where she could choose it or refuse it." She studied him the way a triage nurse studies pain-assessing type duration outcome. Part of her face had already declined the practiced refusal of a woman who keeps her life upright by saying no more often than anyone knows. Another part quieter. Younger glanced sideways at Amara, whose gaze was a steady pleading lamp. "I can make tea," the girl offered shyly, as if hospitality might tip the scales. "Grandma's pot still works. It whistles like it's trying to sing." "Sweetheart," Naomi murmured, and the word held so much warning, gratitude, impossibility. She stepped onto the porch, pulling the screen door nearly closed behind her. Up close, he saw the lack of sleep written in fine script at the corners of her eyes, and beneath it the unextinguished light of someone who still chooses tenderness even when the world allocates none. "I don't know how to do this," she said, honest as a wound. "I don't know where to put you. My days are small on purpose. They fit what needs fitting. If I open one seam, everything wants to pour in." "Then keep the seams," he said. "I'm not here to pull at them. I came to give you the dignity of an explanation asked, not demanded." Her mouth tilted, pain perhaps, or faint relief. "You deserved one," she said. "I could not afford it. I can't promise I can afford it now." "Tell me what you can," he answered. "Or tell me nothing and point to a boundary and I'll honor it. But let me say this out loud where it can stop gnawing at the inside of my ribs. I didn't stop looking for you. I only stopped knowing how." Naomi closed her eyes. The porch fan marked the seconds between them. A mockingbird rehearsed someone else's song on the telephone wire. When she opened her eyes again, her gaze had changed, not yielding, but less armed. "Do you remember the clearing by Bonaventure Lake?" she asked. "Past the willow where the ground dips like a held breath." His answer was already in his body before it reached his mouth. "Yes." "Tonight," she said. "Sunset. I'll be off by then if the shift doesn't turn unruly. We talk there." She glanced over her shoulder toward the hallway. He followed the flicker of her attention and saw the gold-scratch frame, Two teenagers in the throat of summer, almost laughing. Naomi turned back quickly as if she had given away more than she meant to. Not here, she added. This house knows too much. Sunset, he repeated. I'll bring nothing but time. Something like gratitude too swift to be sure of crossed her face. Don't be early, she said. I'll need the walk to rehearse courage. Then I'll be exactly on time. Amara had eased the screen open and now stood between them, fingers curled in the mesh. Will there be ducks? She asked, suddenly practical. At the lake. Always, Ethan said, smiling down at her. They're very punctual. Then it's okay, the girl decided. Ducks make it easier to talk. They pretend not to listen, but they hear everything. Naomi's hand found the child's shoulder and rested there with a gentleness that understood weight. Go inside, sunshine. Pack your library books. We'll stop by after school. When Amara had gone, Naomi looked again at Ethan, as if to seal the hour with an instruction both of them would understand. Whatever we were, she said, deserves exactness. I'll try. I will too. They stood a moment longer, not for words but for the work of looking. It felt like the respectful silence people keep in old churches, the kind that is not empty at all, but filled to the rafters with names. At last she stepped back across the threshold and the screen door feathered shut between them, with that modest sound old houses make when they have been consulted. Ethan descended the steps. The hydrangeas brushed his knees. The world's ordinary morning went on unmoved and faithful. He did not look back until he reached the gate, and when he did, he saw the porch unpeopled. The door latched a blue ribbon of shadow laid along the floorboards where they had stood. He breathed once, as if to test the shape of hope in his lungs, and found it fit. On the walk back toward the river, the city assembled itself around him with a kindness he hadn't known he needed. A baker's first tray set to cool on a sill, school children corralling their laughter at a crosswalk, a florist misting buckets of zinnias that looked like small suns people could buy by the stem. Ethan counted the hours to evening as if they were stitches, each one intended to hold something together. By late afternoon, he would go to the site and stand with the maps and talk about bulkheads and greenways, about how to let a shoreline meet the future without erasing the past. But his true work, he understood, waited where low light threads through willow branches, and the water remembers every word it has ever overheard. There at the clearing that once held their youth like a secret, he and Naomi would lay their separate years side by side and see in the changed silhouettes whether the old promise could still recognize them. The sun was low when Ethan reached the lake, laying a path of trembling gold across the water. The willow at the edge leaned over the surface like a pen determined to keep rewriting its reflection. He had not walked here in 12 years yet. His body knew the trail, the slope, the precise turn where reeds parted, and the earth dipped into a clearing shaped like a secret. Naomi was already there. She stood with her arms folded, a thin cardigan drawn around her shoulders, though the air was mild. The lake wind tugged at a few strands of hair that had escaped her knot. She did not turn at once. She was looking at the water the way one looks at a confidant, wary dependent, hoping it will keep what is said. You came, Ethan said softly, though he meant thank you. I said I would, she replied, voice level, her eyes still on the lake. I'm late often. Not with this. They let silence sit with them a while, the kind that doesn't press, but waits. Ducks cut lines across the surface, their wake bending light into ribbons. A child's laughter carried faintly from the far bank, where families strolled the walking path. It felt almost indecent to set old pain loose in such tender weather, but perhaps that was why she had chosen this place. Pain needs contrast to prove it has been real. When you disappeared, Ethan began, I thought. He stopped, breath heavy. I thought it was me, that I had done something wrong. Naomi closed her eyes. No, it was never you. She turned then, and the weight of years fell into her gaze. The night I left, my grandmother collapsed. A stroke. The kind that empties a person of language and strength in one cruel sweep. She was all I had. There was no one else to sit by her bed to pay bills, to make sure the world did not carry her away while she still breathed. Her voice faltered, but she steadied it with the discipline of a nurse. I was 17. College was supposed to be next. Life was supposed to be next. Instead, I learned how to feed her by hand, how to lift her body without breaking mine. I learned the price of medicine, the sound of nights when sleep cost too much. There was no space left for anything that didn't keep us alive. Ethan stepped closer, the earth soft beneath his shoes. You could have told me, he said, not as reproach, but as a plea for sanity. I would have been there. Naomi's laugh was quick, brittle. At 17, I thought love was a flame, bright, reckless, consuming. How could I drag you into the slow burn of duty, into the long hours of laundry and caregiving, into the humiliation of poverty? You had dreams too. Architecture, city skylines, futures too large for a girl who had become a nurse before she had a license. Her arms tightened around herself. So I disappeared, or thought I did. I thought if I vanished cleanly, you would be angry and then free. That was the gift I told myself I was giving. Gift. Ethan shook his head. It was exile. Naomi's eyes shimmered but held. Do you know how many nights I sat on that porch writing letters I never sent, pages of longing, of apology, of small details I wanted you to have? How the azaleas had bloomed too early. How my grandmother smiled even when she had no words left. How every time I looked at the lake I remembered the sound of you carving initials into bark like it was law. I wrote you entire summers, Ethan, then tore them up or hid them in boxes because sending them would mean admitting I still wanted what I had no right to ask for. She looked away toward the willow. There's a shoebox full of those letters in the attic. Yellowed unsent, a record of a love I couldn't permit myself to keep alive. The dust trembled between them. Ethan's throat ached not from anger now, but from the sharp tenderness of grief. So all this time, he whispered, I thought I was forgotten. And you were remembering me too much to let me know. Naomi's hands opened, palms bare. I was 17. I did not know how to choose both you and duty. I chose duty. I would do it again because my grandmother deserved her last years with dignity. But Ethan, her voice cracked. But I never stopped loving you. That's the truth I owe you now. The air stilled. He wanted to take her hands to anchor them against his chest until they believed again in warmth. But he held back because touch is a covenant and must be offered, not seized. He looked at her, the woman the girl had become, carved by sacrifice and strengthened by tenderness, and felt the shape of his anger dissolve into awe. The lake accepted their silence, folding it into ripples. Naomi turned back toward him, eyes brimming but unfallen. That's why I left. That's why I never wrote except in letters meant only for the dark. Now you know. Ethan nodded slowly. Now I know. And knowing is heavier and lighter at once. They stood side by side at the water's edge, the willow bending over them like a witness. The sky burned itself down to embers, and the truth of departure finally found its voice, spoken not as excuse, but as love tested in the hardest of fires. The days that followed moved with a strange rhythm, as if the city itself were watching two lives circle one another and waiting to see whether they would converge. Naomi worked her long shifts at the hospital shoulders, carrying the invisible weight of other people's pain. Ethan threw himself into drawings and site visits, the measured lines of his renderings, a discipline against the unmeasured longing inside him. But the one who refused to leave the story to its own devices was Amara. She had decided, with the quiet ferocity children reserve for their deepest convictions, that her mother's heart was a garden left too long unwatered, and Ethan Miller was the rain it required. No one asked her to take this role, but she wore it with all the solemnity of a minister and all the cunning of a child who has not yet learned the difference between boldness and audacity. The first attempt came on a Tuesday morning. Ethan had stopped by Harbor and Hearth for coffee before a meeting with city officials. He found Amara waiting at the counter, chin barely clearing the glass case of pastries. You shouldn't eat alone, she announced as if she were quoting scripture. Mama makes pancakes on Tuesdays. We have syrup that doesn't come from a bottle. It comes from a jar with someone's handwriting on the lid. You should come. Ethan blinked, cup halfway to his lips. That sounds tempting, but I wouldn't want to intrude. It's not intruding if you're invited, she said briskly. And I'm inviting you. Mama makes too many anyway. She says she forgets there's only two of us. Her eyes, large and unflinching, left him little room to retreat. "All right," he said. "If your mother agrees." Amara smiled in triumph, then darted to the kitchen where Naomi was plating orders. Ethan watched the exchange, the little girl tugging at her mother's sleeve, whispering with exaggerated discretion. Naomi's startled glance toward him, the faint flush of her cheeks, the reluctant nod of surrender. Minutes later, he found himself seated at their kitchen table syrup jar. Between them, Naomi pouring coffee with the resigned grace of someone who has lost a battle she hadn't known she was fighting. The second scheme arrived more elaborately. Amara appeared at the site office one afternoon, her braids askew, her school uniform smudged with playground dust. She carried a note in blocky letters. "Mama's working late. Someone must walk me home. It is not safe for ducks to cross the street alone, and children are like ducks." Ethan laughed despite himself. "Is this official correspondence?" She nodded gravely. "It has a stamp." She had drawn one in the corner, a crooked heart inside a square. So he walked her home past brick alleys and blooming crepe myrtles. She filled the air with stories which teachers liked to sing, which classmates cheated at jump rope, which neighbors gave out the best Halloween candy. By the time they reached the porch of the Victorian house, the dusk had folded itself around them like a shawl. Naomi opened the door, surprise flashing into a mixture of gratitude and dismay. "Amara," she scolded gently, "you can't keep asking Mr. Miller." "Ethan," the girl corrected. "He doesn't mind, do you?" He met Naomi's gaze, the question caught between them. "Not at all," he said, and for once she did not argue. The third maneuver was the boldest. Amara orchestrated a family outing under the guise of errands. She dragged Ethan into the grocery store with them, insisting he push the cart because he was tall enough to reach the top shelves where the good cereal lives. She made him carry the heavy bags, then declared on the walk back, "See, Mama, he's strong. We need strong." Naomi tried to hush her, but the child persisted, her words blunt and luminous. "Mama, he would be the perfect dad. He listens. He smiles even when he's tired. He looks at you like your music." Naomi froze, groceries balanced against her hip, eyes wide with the ache of being named too truly. Ethan, caught in the delicate net of Amara's candor, could only stand still and breathe. The street seemed to hush around them, cicadas pausing mid-song, as if to make room for the confession of a child. Naomi finally exhaled, shaking her head. "Amara, sweetheart, that's not something you decide." "Then who decides?" the girl demanded. "No one," Naomi murmured. "Or maybe everyone. Or maybe God." But her voice trembled, and Ethan heard what she didn't say. "I am afraid to decide. I don't know if I'm allowed to want." Through it all, Ethan let himself be carried by Amara's mission. Her innocence disarmed him, but it also unsettled him because beneath her playfulness lay truths too sharp for a child to wield safely. He saw how desperately she longed for a father's presence, how fiercely she believed love could be arranged if only the right pieces were placed together. For Naomi, these orchestrations were both torment and gift. She bristled at her daughter's boldness, scolded her for meddling, tried to shield her from disappointment. Yet she did not banish Ethan. Each invitation accepted, each walk shared, each moment of laughter over pancakes or groceries eroded a little more of the wall she had built to survive. Sometimes, after Amara had gone to bed, Naomi would stand at the sink rinsing dishes while Ethan dried them. Their hands brushed in the small silence, and neither spoke of it. Sometimes, when Amara's chatter filled the table, Naomi would glance at Ethan with a look that was half apology, half surrender, as if to say, "This is her doing, not mine, but don't leave yet." One evening, after Amara had orchestrated yet another accidental dinner, Ethan lingered by the porch steps as Naomi tucked her daughter into bed upstairs. When she returned, she stood in the doorway, the lamplight making her eyes seem darker, softer. "She wants so much," Naomi whispered half to herself. "She wants a father, and I can't give her that without risking everything, without risking you." Ethan's reply was steady, though his heart ached. "She's not wrong, Naomi. Children often see before we do." Naomi looked at him a long moment, then turned her face toward the night where the cicadas had resumed their relentless hymn. "She's a child," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. And Ethan, watching the fragile hope flicker in her eyes, knew that Amara's mission was working. Not because it was clever, not because it was relentless, but because it carried the single thing Naomi could never resist: love, offered without condition, brave as only a child could make it. The air around them seemed to wait, filled with the sound of crickets and the faint lap of water from the lake beyond. Somewhere in the balance between longing and fear, a decision was beginning to take shape, slow, fragile, inevitable. The evening drew itself thin and luminous, a silk thread laid across the porch rail. Inside, Amara's room had gone quiet, one last negotiation for water, one last adjustment of the rabbit's ears. And now the house held that particular hush. A sleeping child gives a home like a blessing you're afraid to startle. Naomi stood at the sink, drying her hands on a dish towel that had been washed to softness. Ethan waited by the open door, where the scent of cut grass and the river's clean breath mingled. They had learned this choreography, one of them moving the other, giving space to choose words without being cornered by them. "Come sit," she said at last, voice low. They took the porch steps side by side, their shoulders a careful distance apart. The street lamps had kindled. Moths wrote pale hieroglyphs in their light. Somewhere down the block, a radio played Ella, the notes floating loose and unembarrassed into the dark. "I need to tell you about Amara's father," Naomi began, and the sentence made the night hold still. Ethan didn't move. He had lived with the question long enough to recognize its approach, and still it arrived like weather you cannot prepare for, only stand in. "It was Marcus," she said. "Marcus Green?" The name struck gently and entirely. He could see him in an instant, Marcus at 17, grinning under a too-big baseball cap. Shoulders all promise and unspent strength. Marcus teaching Ethan the ridiculous handshake that took a full minute and 3 inside jokes to complete. Marcus looking at the world like it was a dare he wanted to accept. "I thought you might say that," Ethan answered, honesty clearing a path through the ache. "Or perhaps I feared you would." Naomi's hands knotted the towel until it became a rope. "After my grandmother's stroke, the days got small and hard. You know that part now." Years later, there was a season when even the smallness felt too wide. Marcus came through on leave. He'd enlisted discipline suited him, or maybe he needed a place where the rules were clear. He came to the hospital after a training mishap. Nothing terrible. I recognized him, and he recognized the part of me that still knew how to laugh. She exhaled, then continued more steadily. "We were companions in loneliness. We shared takeout in hallways, badly brewed coffee on plastic chairs. He asked about you. I told him more than I should have. He never made me feel wrong for it." Ethan could see it, the kind, stubborn mercy that Marcus had worn the way some men wear a favorite jacket. He was good at that, he said, letting people be whole in front of him. Naomi nodded. "We kept each other from drowning. That's all. We tried to tell the truth about it even while we were in it. He said once, 'We're the same kind of stranded, you and me. Let's share a fire until morning.'" Her voice softened. "Amara was conceived the weekend before his next deployment. He was so happy when I told him, nervous, but happy. He said maybe the world had voted yes on him after all." She swallowed. "He died 2 weeks before she was born. Training accident. The kind of phrase that sounds bureaucratic until it breaks your life." The porch took the weight of her silence without complaint. Ethan found he had braced for jealousy and discovered instead a complicated, aching gratitude. He didn't get to meet her. He said a statement and a sorrow. "No," Naomi whispered. "But he talked to her every night on video calls. He made me promise to tell her stories, good ones, the kind that teach your bones you're loved." She glanced toward the dark square of Amara's window. "I kept that promise." They let the moths finish a sentence, neither could speak. The towel eased in Naomi's hands. "I need you to hear this part carefully," she said. "What I had with Marcus was never what I had with you. We cared deeply. We were kind. We were honest about the limits of our hearts. He said he didn't want to marry me if marriage meant pretending our first choices were different. He wanted any child we had to grow up inside truth." Ethan's eyes stung in a way that felt clean. "That sounds like him, too." "I've been afraid," Naomi admitted, daring the word into air, "that if I told you, you'd think you were a consolation prize, or that you'd stay out of a sense of duty to him." I can live with many things. I can't live with either of those. I won't make you, Ethan said, and the answer surprised him with its certainty. I loved you before duty had a name. Learning that Marcus loved you too doesn't make the love smaller. It makes the circle larger. She turned to him, then searching his face for the catch, the edge, the place where he might be lying to be kind. Finding none, she let out a breath that sounded like the end of a long shift, the body's first permission to unclench. He left something, she said almost shyly. She rose and slipped inside, returned with a small wooden box, the varnish rubbed thin at the corners by more than one thumb. From it, she lifted a photograph, three teenagers in graduation robes, caps tilted, joy reckless. Ethan and Marcus shoulder to shoulder, Naomi between them, her smile sure of the horizon. On the back in Marcus's hurried print, if I don't make it home and Naomi needs help, find Ethan. He's the best man I know. He loved her first. Take care of them both for me. Ethan held the words the way he might hold a newborn, awkwardly, reverently aware that his hands were too clumsy for what they were entrusted with. He always did have the inconvenient habit of being right, he said, and the ache in his chest rearranged itself into something like resolve. Naomi's laugh came wet and grateful. She wiped her cheeks with the heel of her hand. I wanted you to see it, so you'd know I'm not asking you to step into a ghost. I'm asking you to step into a house where a good man once lived and left the door unlocked. Ethan set the photograph on his knee, the past warming to the skin. I won't replace him, he said. I couldn't. I wouldn't try. But I could be the man who teaches Amara to ride a bike without lying about the hands that would have steadied her first. Naomi looked away, and when she looked back, her eyes were luminous in the porch light. That's the only answer I hope for. They sat without touching, and yet the space between them changed less like a border, more like a threshold. Beyond the fence, the river turned itself toward morning. In the quiet, Ethan found himself speaking to the air in a voice meant for a friend he had not addressed in years. Marcus, he said softly, I hear you. The moths went on with their indecipherable writing. Naomi folded the towel at last into something tidy, as if readying the evening for rest. When she finally reached for the photograph and slid it back into the box, her fingers brushed Ethan's. Not an accident, not a claim. An agreement tender, exact about the kind of truth they would build and the kind of love that could hold it. The note was small enough to hide beneath a palm, and yet it altered the weight of the night. Naomi unfolded it with the caution people reserve for things that can't be replaced. Paper gone soft along its creases, ink smudged where a thumb must have pressed too long. Marcus's hurried hand, the slant he used when feeling outran patience. She did not speak as she passed it to Ethan. She didn't need to. Some words can only be read in silence. If anything happens to me, find Ethan. He's the best man I know. He loved Naomi first. Take care of them both for me. He read it once, then again, the letters steadier, each time, as if the page were teaching his eyes how to bear them. The porch light made a warm coin of the paper. Beyond the rail, the street lifted its faint city music tires on wet asphalt, a far laugh, the patient hush of the river working in the dark. Ethan felt the years narrow to a single point in his chest. Marcus's voice rose unbidden, stitched to a dozen summers, shouting across the ball field, hurling advice and joy with equal generosity. Quiet at midnight, two boys on a dock learning how to tell the truth without flinching. Gentle the day Ethan's father drank too much, and hope needed a second set of hands. Best man. The phrase broke him open and set him right in the same breath. He had not applied for the title. He had been living toward it without knowing. Naomi watched him with the exquisite restraint of a nurse at a bedside, attending every change, while pretending to see none. When he looked up, her eyes were wet, not with apology, but with the kind of grief that honors. He put that in a box with the graduation photo, she said. I couldn't read it for months. When I finally did, it felt less like a request and more like a truth he already trusted. Ethan swallowed. His voice when it came was roughened by reverence. He knew me too well. He always did. He knew himself too, Naomi said softly. Knew what kind of blessing a man can give when he won't be there to do the work himself. Ethan turned the note over as if the paper might have more to reveal on its unmarked face. Memory rushed up Marcus, limping off a field and refusing to make it about pain. Marcus buying 2 sandwiches and pretending he wasn't hungry, so the second one could become a surprise. Marcus learning the discipline of saying, "I don't know," out loud. He had never been a saint. That made the goodness count double. "I don't know how to hold this," Ethan admitted. "It wrecks me, and it steadies me." He breathed in, breathed out a measured cadence he'd learned on scaffolds and floodplains. It ties the past to the future in a knot I can't and won't undo. Naomi's shoulders loosened, just perceptibly. "That's why I showed you. I didn't want a promise from you that was born out of pity. I wanted to share the promise that was born out of friendship, that lived before we were any of this." He looked toward the dark square of Amara's window. The house had that late evening fullness, the sense that love had taken inventory and found its people safe for one more night. "He's asking me for something and giving me permission at the same time," Ethan said. "Take care of them both for me. That's a task and a benediction." Naomi folded the note and returned it to the wooden box, settling it like a treasure into its place. "It scared me the first time I read it," she confessed. "Not because I doubted you, because I doubted the size of my own heart. I wondered if loving you would feel like moving someone into a room where a good man's coat still hangs. But it turns out the room is bigger than I knew. We don't have to take down what belonged to him to make space for what belongs to us." Ethan closed his eyes. The metaphor landed with the almost audible click of something fitting. "We can live in the whole house," he said. "Leave the coat. Tell the stories. Teach the child both names. Yes, a small luminous yes. Teach her both names." They sat with that for a while, letting the porch boards memorize the shape of this new shared understanding. Somewhere a dog barked once and was answered. Somewhere a screen door sighed, then held its breath. Ethan thought of the work waiting for him at the river, the business of building against flood, without pretending water will ever grow obedient, and realized this too was an act of design, not an erasure, a joining. Make the structure sound enough to carry weight, porous enough to let the past breathe through. "I'll go to him," Ethan said almost to himself. "Tomorrow, I'll take your blessing if you'll give it." She nodded. "Take it, and take mine." She hesitated. "He's under a young maple. You'll know it when you see the little drawings. Amara leaves them in page protectors, like she's archiving joy." He smiled at that, a brief, unguarded softness. "Of course she does." Naomi rose, gathered the box, then paused with her hand on the doorknob. She turned back, uncertainty and courage braided in her gaze. "Ethan, I don't want you to feel trapped by a dead man's hope." He stood as well, closing the small distance between them without crossing it. "I don't," he said. "I feel seen by a friend who knew what I'd choose if ever I were lucky enough to be asked." The radio down the block found the last chorus and let it linger. In the pause that followed, Ethan reached out. Not to claim, not to finish, but to set a hand lightly over the box she held. A gesture of a scent of custody shared. "Then go to him," she whispered. "Tell him yourself." "I will." He watched her disappear into the lamplight of the hallway, the wooden box cradled against her like something that could warm. Alone on the steps, he looked up into a sky that had let a few bright stars through, not many, just enough to persuade the dark to be generous. He breathed Marcus's name into the air and felt with a clarity both devastating and comforting that his life had just been given back to him in a shape he could finally recognize, not a straight road, not a circle, but 2 paths braided by affection, past and future, intertwined strong as a promise written in a familiar hand. Morning found the cemetery washed clean, the grass holding beads of light like a field of small prayers. Ethan parked by the low stone wall and walked the path that curled up a gentle rise past names the city had said aloud for generations. The older markers leaned toward one another in their long conversation. The newer rows stood at attention, bright granite with dates that ended too soon. Wind combed the maple leaves overhead, turning them into 1,000 green hands. He didn't need a map. Naomi had said a young maple drawings tucked into page protectors. Love leaves a trail, and he followed it, Crayon Sun's a house with three figures holding hands, a stick figure girl with braids labeled Amara in purposeful letters, butterflies in improbable blues, a lake in a shy oval, a tree bending to see itself. Beneath them Marcus green, the clean lines of the stones softened by weather and attentions. Someone Naomi surely had placed a small vase at the base, daisies fierce in their simplicity. Ethan stood a moment with his hands in his pockets, then took them out as if honesty required empty palms. The morning smelled of damp earth and cut grass with the faintest undertone of oil and metal from the road below. He cleared his throat not to prepare words so much as to make room for them. "Hey, brother," he said, the old address falling into place as if it had been waiting on his tongue. "It's been a long time." Silence gathered without pressing on him. The world did what it does when people talk to the dead it heard, and it looked away. "I got your note," Ethan went on, a wry, cracked softness in his voice. "The one you left with the graduation photo. Bossy to the end." He smiled and let the smile fade because the truth was wider than humor. "Thank you." He crouched to look at the drawings. One showed a man with unruly hair holding the hand of a child. The child was saying, "We're brave," a speech bubble bright with certainty. The man had the cautious smile of someone who cannot believe his luck and is trying not to scare it off. Ethan felt an unguarded thing move in his chest. "She's extraordinary," he said. "You know that. You chose her name like a blessing before you'd met her. She has your confidence and Naomi's steadiness. She asks for what she needs and things grown-ups overcomplicate it on purpose." He looked past the stone at the horizon line where the river lay like a silver promise. "She wants a father. I want to be that man. I won't pretend I've earned it yet. I will show up until I do." He set a hand on the top edge of the stone, the gesture as tentative as it was reverent. "I'm not here to replace you. I couldn't if I tried, and I won't try. You're her daddy. I'll be the one who ties the laces before the race, who says no when it matters and yes when it heals. The one who teaches her to ride a bike and when she falls reminds her that gravity is not a verdict, only a rule. I will not take your stories out of the house. We'll make room for them at the table." A breeze moved through the maple, a cool passing hand. Ethan took a breath that tasted of leaf and morning. "I loved you, Marcus. Not the way the world writes love in poems, but the way boys teach one another how to be men without breaking anything important. You talked me out of stupid into brave, into decent. You gave me the first language of loyalty. I hear your voice in the better parts of mine." He let that sit. The cemetery held the quiet like a bowl. "I'll take care of them," he said at last, the words finding their final shape. "Not because you ask, though the asking undoes me, but because I was already pointed there before I knew it. I love Naomi. I love your daughter. I will love them with integrity. I will honor you with the honesty of it. If ever I forget how I expect you to haunt me in the kindest possible way." He straightened, and without thinking corrected the angle of one-page protector where rain had worried its corner loose. The crayon house looked a little steadier for his trouble. On impulse, he reached into his satchel and drew out a folded sheet from his notebook. He was not much of an artist, but he sketched for a living and knew how to find the bones of a place. In a few clean lines, he drew the willow by the lake, two initials tucked small at the edge of the trunk, and beneath the tree a little figure with braids throwing petals into the air, as if they were answers. He wrote for Amara from Ethan at the bottom, slid the page into an empty sleeve, and anchored it with a smooth stone. "Proof of attendance," he said half to the wind. "You know how inspectors are." The joke gentled the moment without diminishing it. He went quiet again, letting the day make its own soft noises, bee-far truck, leaf against leaf. A flash of color caught the corner of his eye. A red cardinal lit on the low branch of the maple head, cocked black mask sharp against the extravagant red. It regarded him with that bright, unblinking attention birds give the living, as if cataloging them for later. Ethan laughed under his breath. "You always were a show-off," he said, and did not ask for a sign. He let the sign be what it was, a small, blazing presence that made the green deeper by contrast. The cardinal hopped closer along the branch, then sang a clear, piercing phrase thin as a silver wire drawn through air. The sound seemed to lift the weight from the grass itself. When the bird flew, cutting a red seam through the morning, it left a hush behind that was not emptiness, but permission. "Okay," Ethan whispered, "okay." He touched the stone once more, palm flat, a promise sealed against the cool, and stepped back. He looked down the row at the other names, the dates, the short lives made long by the people who carry them forward. He did not feel brave or holy. He felt chosen the way a task chooses a hand. On the way back to the car, he turned once to look at the maple. Light came through the leaves like a benediction broken into pieces small enough to keep. He pictured Naomi in the kitchen, later braids threaded through her fingers as she listened to Amara narrate the day. He pictured the gold-scratched frame in the hallway, catching the late sun, three young faces still sure of the horizon. He pictured the lake, the willow, the path of water, the wind wrote and rewrote. By the time he reached the gate, his resolve had settled into a quiet that didn't need witnesses. He would go to the riverside after lunch. He would meet with engineers, speak of tides and bulkheads, of the art of holding and letting go. Then he would walk to a Victorian porch and ring a bell and tell a woman the truth, that he had seen her past and asked it for its blessing, and that it had offered not chains, but a cardinal streak of red across the morning, swift, undeniable, and gone, leaving only the certainty that he was facing the right direction. Trust did not arrive with trumpets. It came like morning through lace curtains, quiet, patterned by the past, and patient enough to make its way into every room. The three of them learned its language in small, ordinary syllables: a pan warm before the eggs, a squeaky hinge, soothed by a drop of oil, the sound of a hammer finding true. On Sundays, they cooked together in the narrow kitchen that had belonged to Naomi's grandmother. The room still held the old woman's advice in the way drawers stuck at humid hours and the way the oven ran hot unless you asked it nicely. Naomi moved with practiced economy, onions, diced to even sweetness, garlic coaxed, until it surrendered its bitterness. Ethan discovered he liked to stand at the cutting board and offer his hands to what the recipe asked next. Zest a lemon strip, thyme, hold the bowl, while Amara whisked batter with fierce concentration. Light circles, he told her, guiding her grip until the whisk skimmed the surface like a skater. "We persuade, not bully. So like grown-ups," she declared, pleased. Naomi hid a smile in the steam. They ate at the small oak table by the window, knees bumping under the cloth chairs, singing their thin wood songs. Conversation traveled the nimble path children lay down for it. A question about fractions became a digression. About birds became a memory of a patient who gifted Naomi a paper crane after recovery. Ethan listened with his whole posture, leaning toward Amara's grand theories, toward Naomi's quiet wit. He took seconds without apology when Naomi cooked her grandmother's red rice and he stacked dishes without being asked. None of it was grand and none of it was small. Weeknights drew them to the house's stubborn corners. A stair tread had grown loose. A window refused to meet its frame. The porch rail listed like an old sailor. Ethan arrived with a toolbox and the reverence of a man who knows repair is a form of love. He showed Amara the names of things: spokeshave, brad, countersink, and the girl repeated them as if she were learning a spell. Check twice, he'd say, measuring tape bright in the lamplight. Cut once. Like promises, she returned, solemn as a judge. They planed a swollen door until it exhaled and swung true. They replaced a rung on the staircase, Ethan holding the level, while Naomi steadied the banister with both palms as if blessing it. He learned where the old wiring sulked and where not to put a knee unless he wanted to introduce himself to the floor below. The house, patient and particular, seemed to lift incrementally under their care, as though relief were something with weight. On a Saturday bright, with the kind of blue that insists on picnics, they began the treehouse. It sat in the generous arms of the backyard oak, a platform Clara had built when Naomi was small, now tired and uncertain of itself. Ethan climbed first, testing each ladder rung before trusting it with his weight. From the ground, Amara craned up like a sunflower. "What's the verdict, doctor of trees?" she called. "Good bones," he answered, grinning down. But the railing's a rumor and the floor has opinions. We'll give it new shoulders. They made a list on the back of a grocery receipt, sand splinters add braces, replace the sway in the rope ladder with a steadier climb, build a proper guardrail that wrapped like an arm. Naomi fetched lemonade and eventually gloves. She would not be relegated to the sidelines of her own history. She held boards in place while Ethan drove screws her forearms strong and beautiful with effort. When the drill bit caught, he looked up and found her looking back, laughter balanced on her mouth like a bird deciding whether to stay. It stayed. Why does it feel holy, she asked quietly later, when the new railing took its final screw and Amara whooped from the branch below. Because we're mending a place meant for joy, he said. Places remember. They christened the rebuilt perch with a tea party hosted by a delegation of dolls and one skeptical stuffed rabbit. Ethan accepted his cup with gravity. Naomi poured imaginary lapsang as if she had trained at the Ritz. Amara presided, hair escaping its braids, cheeks lit with ownership. Rules, she announced. No one can fall, and if they do, we tell the truth first and hug second. Agreed, Ethan said. Naomi nodded, eyes bright. The work crept indoors in tender ways. A leaking tap, long tolerated, stopped its petty sorrows under Ethan's attention. He replaced the cracked window pane in the upstairs hall, and Naomi stood with him in the dust and sunlit stairwell while he eased the glass into putty. My grandmother said a repaired thing loves you back twice, she murmured. He glanced at her heartbeat, stuttering in time with the brush he turned to smooth the line. Then this house is about to be devoted. Sometimes trust looked like paperwork, Ethan phoning a contractor he respected to assess the roof before hurricane season, arranging without fanfare to have a dehumidifier delivered for the crawl space. When Naomi protested the expense, he didn't lecture or dismiss. He opened his notebook, set the estimates side by side, and said, We'll phase it. We'll do what matters first, and I'll be here for the rest. She pressed her lips together and nodded. Something softened in her, going quiet rather than brittle. And sometimes trust looked like rest. After dinner one evening, while Amara arranged a regimen of crayons and chromatic allegiance, Naomi slumped on the couch with that particular exhaustion only nurses and single mothers know. Ethan set a quilt over her legs, turned off the harsh lamp, and replaced it with the pull of a softer one. When she stirred, he pressed a finger to his lips and took the dish towel from her hand. She slept for 20 minutes. The house recalibrated around the fact of it and seemed grateful. They ended nights on the porch where the fan wrote circles in air. Fireflies stitched their disappearing punctuation into the yard's dim edges. Amara made a nest on the steps with a book and read aloud, faltering on longer words until one of them bridged the gap. When she yawned, Naomi sent her up with a kiss and a reminder about the library due date. The quiet that followed was companionable, thick with unspent words, and the contentment of not needing them. Thank you, Naomi said once, after a day of sanding and lemonade, and a triumphant unveiling of a railing that could keep a child safe. It was late enough that her voice had sand in it, early enough that the street hadn't surrendered itself to crickets entirely. For showing up, for not making a song and dance about it. Showing up is the song, he said, and meant it. She turned her face toward him, the porch light catching the new unguarded angles of trust there. She didn't reach for his hand. She didn't need to. Between them lay the exactness of nails-driven flush of meals, shared of a child who had begun to edit her drawings to include a man at the edge of the page, and then boldly at the center. In the treehouse that night, a ribbon fluttered from the new railing, Amara's invention, a dedication. She had written in careful print, "This is safe now." The words moved in the breeze like a benediction. Inside the house, a faucet no longer leaked. The stair no longer protested. A window yielded to its frame with a satisfying click. Trust, it turned out, was not a feeling that arrived on schedule, but a structure they built together, brace by brace, laugh by laugh, apology by apology, until it could bear the weight of all three of them and offer a view worth climbing for. The attic had kept its own weather since Clara's time, cooler than the rest of the house, scented with cedar and the faint talc of old papers. Afternoon light angled through the little gable window, turning dust motes into quiet constellations. Naomi climbed the narrow steps with a rag in her back pocket and her hair knotted against the heat, intent on clearing the last of the boxes no one ever truly meant to keep. She found it behind the Christmas ornaments in a stack of hymnals, an unremarkable carton, its flaps taped and retaped, a length of blue ribbon looped around as if someone had promised to come back soon. Across the top in Clara's tidy hand, Naomi's letters. Not from only Naomi's, as if that were enough to name a life entire. Her knees went weak. She sat on the trunk and pulled the ribbon loose. Inside lay a sheaf of envelopes addressed in the careful script she had taught herself at 17, so that words would look like they meant what they said. Ethan Miller, the name repeated year after year like a rosary bead. Most had no stamps, no postmarks, only dates in the corner, and the pale watermark of dried courage. The first was thin, the paper folded crisply. She slid it free and read 2 sentences and had to close her eyes. We left at dawn. I practiced not crying until I got good at it. Tell me how the lake looks without us. The ache was so specific it felt like a scent. She carried the box downstairs as if it were sleeping. Ethan was in the dining room with a tape measure and a pencil behind his ear, aligning a picture frame. He looked up when she appeared with that particular gravity he reserved for the fragile. "What did you find?" he asked, voice already softer. "Another kind of time," she said. "Stay." They sat on the old sofa where the Springs remembered 100 holidays. Naomi set the box between them, her fingers light on the lid, then lifted the first letters out and handed one to him. "I wrote you," she said. "I just never sent you what you deserved." He opened the envelope with the care of a man reading a will. The paper had gone the color of tea. His eyes moved, then slowed, then went back with the small, reverent impatience of someone falling through a trap door into the past. He smiled at a line and made a quiet sound at another, like a breath meeting a stone. They read aloud in pieces, trading ears. 17, when everything felt like a first draft and the margins were generous. I am learning the names of medicines and the patience of soup. 18, when winter pressed both hands to the windows. Today I taught Grandma to say yes with her eyes. 21, a spring letter that smelled of cut grass just because the language carried it. A nurse said I have steady hands. I have never felt steadier and never felt lonelier. 26, the year Naomi wrote about Marcus with honesty and care. We are walking each other home for this stretch. I believe you would understand. 30, when Amar arrived in the world with an astonished cry. She has your stubbornness about mornings and a mouth that believes in joy. I am terrified. I am saved. Sometimes they laughed. Naomi had a way of teasing her younger self with a gentleness that felt like rescue. Listen to me scolding you about sunscreen, she murmured, and Ethan barked a soft laugh because of course she had. Sometimes they fell quiet, the kind that lets a room expand. In that hush, the house listened to old wood, settling into the news that love had been here the whole time, simply waiting for the right light to show itself. I thought I was forgotten, Ethan said, folding one letter on his knee, thumb smoothing an old crease. And you were busy remembering me so hard you couldn't spare the stamps. Naomi's smile came wet. I told myself that sending them was selfish, that if I reached across the distance, you'd feel obliged to reach back. I kept thinking love should be generous enough to disappear if that's what the other person needed. And instead it was generous enough to endure, he answered. Privately, stubborn as a live oak. They kept going. Pages that smelled faintly of lemon oil and summer. Quick notes from hospital corridors, words leaning on one another like friends in a waiting room. Passages where she apologized to a boy who had no address anymore, where she confessed that the moon made her reckless, where she promised to keep the best parts of their story taut and unbroken, even if her hands were busy with other work. Ethan read one quietly to himself and then handed it to her to read aloud. If love is work, then I am employed forever. If love is rest, I understand why we call the good kind of tired a blessing. Her throat closed on the second sentence. He took the page back and finished it in a voice that felt wider than his own. When the pile thinned, Naomi reached for a final envelope, thicker, the paper newer, 6 months old. The ink still had its opinion. She had written the night after Clara died, when the house hummed with absence and the future knocked with both hands. I am coming home, Ethan. I don't know how to be brave enough to look for you, and I can't stand not looking. If you ever see these, know that my love did not die for lack of mail. It lived on what it could find: work kindness, the sight of a girl falling asleep with her mouth open, the mercy of laughing at my own stubborn heart. They did not speak for some time after that. The tree outside gave a leaf to the window. The fan in the kitchen turned the air slow as honey. Ethan set the letters back into their box as a librarian might return a rare book, then took Naomi's hand because after all that language touch was the only honest footnote. I wish I'd had these, he said, and I'm grateful I didn't. Both are true. If I'd read them, then I would have come, and maybe I would have broken something you needed whole. She traced the tendon in his wrist, the small blue river there. We would have tried to carry each other and dropped what we were meant to hold. Or maybe not. I don't know, but this I do. We are here now with all of it in the room. Not just what we wanted, what we paid, what we kept. He nodded, the movement slow, a yes gathered from more than a decade of no s. The letters weren't sent, he said, but they did their work. They kept the truth intact. And now they have one more job. What's that? To remind us that distance and duty can shape love without thinning it. So when the next hard thing comes, and it will, we'll know the way home. She closed her eyes not to hide tears, but to feel them. When she opened them, something unafraid moved there. Take them, she said, pushing the box toward him. They're yours as much as mine. A record of what stubbornness looks like when it's holy. He shook his head. They live here. But make me a thief. I'll borrow one at a time and bring it back with flowers. She laughed, the low, relieved kind that loosens the spine. Deal. Evening arrived and found them still side by side, the letters dozing between them, the house altered by nothing visible and everything essential. Down the hall, Amara rehearsed a presentation to invisible classmates. In the yard, the rebuilt treehouse kept its quiet vigil. The gold-scratched frame in the entry caught a last stroke of sun and threw it across the floor like a ribbon. They sat in that spill of light, two people who had traveled long in opposite directions and met again, not by accident, but by the strange, precise geometry of love that refuses to forget its first language. The silence between them was no longer a weight. It was a promise that what had endured in ink and unsent envelopes could learn at last to speak in the present tense. The willow kept its promise. It bowed toward the water as it always had, gathering the light in its green fingers and letting it fall in dappled coins upon the shore. Late afternoon stitched gold along the lake's skin. Dragonflies traced their quick blue cursive, and far off a child's laughter drifted like a blessing that had wandered to the right place. Chairs waited in tidy rows upon the grass. At the aisle's end, beneath an arch of birch and ribbon, stood the man who had learned patience and the woman who had learned endurance, and between them the time they thought had been spent but was simply accruing interest. An empty chair held a folded dress uniform and a single white rose. When the breeze lifted the edge of the jacket, it seemed to nod the way a friend does when a plan finally comes together. Amara went first. In a dress the color of dawn, she scattered petals with a precision that would have satisfied any architect. Not too many, never too few, a small constellation for each step. Her braids ticked against her shoulders. Her mouth was set with the gravity of someone entrusted with the last line of a story. She reached the arbor, turned, and flashed her mother a smile bright enough to make the lake catch it and throw it back. Then Naomi walked. No music could have outsung the hush that followed the first sight of her ivory silk softened by lace. Clara's gown altered to fit the woman who had become its heir. She carried a bouquet of gardenias and rosemary. The air around her smelled like courage and memory. For a heartbeat, Ethan felt 17 again, the summer wind in his hair, and the future so close it almost frightened him. Then she put her hand in his, and he was exactly the age he needed to be. Pastor Williams kept the words simple. Love, he said, was work and rest, a discipline and a feast. Love was a house big enough for the living and the remembered. Love was a shoreline that learned to meet the tide without giving itself away. Ethan turned to Naomi and let the world grow quiet until only water and breath remained. I have loved you, he said in the tense of hoping and the tense of waiting. Today I love you in the tense that finally fits. I promise constancy when the map goes blank, tenderness when the day goes brittle, and laughter enough to keep the windows open. I will show up when it is easy, when it is not, and especially when the story needs a steady hand. He turned to Amara, then the small, fierce witness who had dragged him gently, inexorably into the life he wanted. He went to one knee so his eyes would be level with hers. Amara Johnson, he said, and the name shone like a medal. I promise what I have any right to promise, and more, that you are my daughter truly and fully, not by accident or obligation, but by choice that never expires. I will be the one who shows up at recitals and science fairs, who ruins pancakes and fixes hinges, who listens to the middle of your stories and the endings too. I will never erase your daddy. I will tell you his stories and mine until they live together the way the river lives with the shore. She nodded, lips pressed tight to hold in whatever might spill. Naomi's hand found Ethan's shoulder. For a moment, all vows were one vow braided. Naomi's voice, when it came, carried both lullaby and oath. Ethan, she said, you arrived without rescue in your hands and did the braver thing, you brought patience. I promise to meet you there in the slow rooms where trust grows. I will not hoard the past. We will invite it to sit and be kind. I will tell the truth even when it makes more work, and I will let your tenderness finish what my strength begins. With you, I choose a life of steady joy. Pastor Williams asked his questions, old as covenant and fresh as water. Do you take? I do, Ethan said, clear and bright. I do, Naomi answered, and her yes wore a crown of relief. He turned to Amara again. And do you accept me as your father? I do, she whispered, and then louder, because this was a day for testimonies. I really, really do. By the power vested in me, the pastor said, a smile thickening his voice. I pronounce what love has already finished. He nodded to Ethan. Go on. The kiss was not fireworks, it was shelter. It had learned to be made of breath not held, and of years finally laid down. When they parted, the willow shook a few leaves like confetti, and the lake lifted a small, satisfied wave. Applause rolled soft and wholehearted across the grass. In the second row, Ruby dabbed her eyes with a napkin and announced she would bake a pie for every anniversary until she ran out of sugar or stubbornness. Mrs. Henderson declared the couple sound construction. Engineers from the waterfront project, accustomed to measuring other people's certainty with calipers, merely nodded and looked secretly grateful. Amara wove herself between Ethan and Naomi and tugged them, close arms flung wide, to catch as much of them as she could. I told you my plan would work, she breathed, triumphant and tender all at once. You did, Naomi laughed, kissing her daughter's forehead, and then, just because she could, kissing her husband again. You did, strategist. They walked down the aisle together, three shadows stitched into one upon the grass, past the empty chair that wasn't empty at all. Ethan paused and touched two fingers to the folded uniform, a small salute. The breeze turned the maple leaf overhead. Somewhere a cardinal gave a single clean note that hung in the air like agreement. The reception happened the way the best ones do, under strings of lights that made evening itself seem conspiratorial and kind. Children chased each other with ribbons from the birch arch. Elders held court on quilts. Ethan danced badly and with delight. Naomi laughed until she forgot to be careful. Amara taught Ethan how to spin without dropping hands. When the cake was cut, more petals flew left over from a basket that had insisted on abundance, and they stuck in Ethan's hair like small celebratory stars. Later, after the toast and the first dance to a song that had waited for them, the three of them slipped to the dock. Feet above water, sky above willow, they sat with their shoulders touching, which felt like a conclusion and like the right beginning. Tell me the story again, Amara said, as she always did. Ethan drew a breath of rosemary and river. Once upon a time, he began, there was a boy and a girl who fell in love by this lake. The world asked for everything, and for a while they gave it. But love's stubborn, practical, miraculous kept its place for them. It taught them how to wait, how to work, and how to recognize a 7-year-old prophet when she came in a yellow raincoat. Naomi rested her head on his shoulder, and then, and then he said they went home. When they rose, the party called them back with music and light. They turned together, 3 hands threaded the lake at their backs, holding the reflection of a future finally unafraid of itself. If this story moved you, if you cheered for a love that made room for truth and for a family stitched together by choice as much as by fate, share your favorite moment in the comments. Tap the heart so others can find this lakeside vow, and follow for the next tale where hope learns a new shape. Your voice keeps these stories alive.